is another case study on the ROI of data. So it's around data and analytics in the nonprofit sector. So they are meeting the unique information needs and value opportunities of charities and nonprofit organizations. So joining us this afternoon is Jennifer Bartholomew, the Director of Insights and Data for the Plan International Canada. So Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Bartholomew. I've been working in data analytics and more recently AI for more than 25 years in various capacities, most of it in not-for-profit organizations, ranging from industry associations to much more recently, over the last 5 years, charities. Currently, I'm the Director of Data and AI at Plan International Canada, as well as a board member at the Toronto Wildlife Centre. Originally, my colleague, Rudy Broers, was going to join me here today, but unfortunately, a last-minute issue prevented him from joining us. And I'm really sorry that you'll miss the opportunity to hear him speak, because he has more than a decade's experience in the trenches of the hardest part of the job. So I'm really hoping I can do justice to some of the material that he put together for me to share with you today as well. So one thing that was a little bit funny to me when I pivoted into the nonprofit space a few years ago is that when I talk to people in the for-profit sector, and I mention that I do data work, and now even more so with AI work, quite often they seem surprised that even a large nonprofit would have data science and AI teams. It's like, what does a nonprofit need all that stuff for? So that's the question that I'm here to answer, and I really want to share my enthusiasm for this space, because I find the data challenges of nonprofit data really uniquely exciting. Because not only do nonprofits need to use data for everything that a for-profit organization does, but over and above that, we do need to use it in ways that no for-profit organization would, and while facing some challenges that may sometimes exist in the for-profit space, but they're not that common there. Not unheard of, not common. So basically, if you really love data and quantification and all of the challenges associated with that, and you want to play the data game on the hardest possible setting, I highly recommend it. It's the boss battle. So to get back to my original question, what do nonprofits use data for anyway? Pretty much everything a for-profit company does, and also a lot of other really cool things. So here I'm sharing some examples of the kinds of deliverables that data teams work on in any for-profit organization. So for each of these, we have direct equivalents in the nonprofit world. So a lot of the metrics, in fact, that were designed for the for-profit world are directly replaceable in the not-for-profit context, just with a slightly different change in the name. So for example, CES, which is the customer effort score, we have an equivalent in the nonprofit world, which is the donor effort score. And this is a key metric that's used by sales teams in all industries around the world to answer the question, how hard are we to do business with? It's incredibly an important question if you want to retain customers, and it offers immediate, actionable information on how we can better satisfy and retain those customers, and is every bit as relevant to nonprofit teams looking to retain our recurring donors over the long haul. And at the same time, of course, not-for-profits and nonprofits have finance departments, we have HR departments, we have all the other departments that a for-profit company has that also needs data to support their day-to-day operations. But nonprofits have to do something that for-profit companies almost never do with their data, which is to prove to external actors, to donors, and to the public that we've actually fulfilled our core mission. Because there are a lot of eyes on us, especially those of the donors and taxpayers trusting us with their hard-earned dollars, and they want to make sure that we are achieving our goals. So to contrast with how this looks in the for-profit sector, I'm going to share some mission statements of some very well-known for-profit companies. And I want to be really clear here. These are not the corporate social responsibility statements of these companies. These are their actual corporate mission statements, which in theory explain what the company does and what purpose it serves. So you might think of Patagonia as an outdoors products company, but it turns out they're actually in business to save our home planet. Starbucks, sure, they make coffee, but their mission is to inspire and nurture the human spirit. Target, helping all families discover the joy of everyday life. These are amazing missions, but can you imagine being on the data team that was mandated to measure any of these things as part of their core operational strategy? But happily for those data teams, none of these companies face existential risk if they can't figure out how to quantify how much they saved the planet, how much they inspired the human spirit, or helped discover joy. But quantification of mission delivery is critical to nonprofit funding streams. It is a non-negotiable for us. And because of the nature of the work, they create some of the most interesting definitional and quantification challenges that any data team can be presented with. So by contrast, here are some examples of nonprofit mission statements. The top one is my current employer, Plan International Canada. But all of these are nonprofits that I've worked for in different capacities, which is why I chose them. And so if you're a data person, which I think we all are in this room, I think you can see where I'm going with this. These ask some really hard definitional questions before we can even get to quantification. So I think we can all agree that these are important missions, right? Depending on your priorities, some of these might resonate with you more than others. But I think we all really agree that advancing children's rights and equality for girls is important. We all want to live in a healthy community for people and wildlife. We all want to help people and communities build resilience. But how do we define and measure each of these things in ways that don't just feel good, but actually allow us to populate a database with columns and rows? So for example, looking at the Plan International Canada mission statement, the very first question is, how are you going to define children? Because we operate in multiple countries around the world, the definition of child can vary in these, and even within a country, a particular project might focus on a very different age group from another one. So for example, we might have an infant and child health program, or in another country, we might have an apprenticeship program for teenagers and young women. Next question, what rights are we advancing? In one country, the needs as well as the rights limitations are going to be very different from another country. So in some sectors, there are very standard indicators and measurements. If you're working in this space, everybody pretty much knows what numbers you're expected to provide. But in other sectors, the indicator of success is much less clear-cut. It requires a little bit of creative quantification and definition. So we can't just take all of these different projects and all of these different countries and roll it all up to one big aggregate number. We need to collect very different disparate data from a very wide variety of projects and then find ways that we can aggregate these to share the information in ways that still tell a meaningful story. And what that means is that you don't usually have one outcome metric or one impact metric or one number that measures your mission statement. It's a variety of them, and they all need to work together to be telling a cohesive story. So here are some excerpts from the most recent annual reports from a couple of these organizations. And I want to be clear, this is a very small subset of a very big report, so they do not tell by any means the whole story for either organization of the work to fulfill the mission. But they are some examples of how we can tell the story in key indicators and data related to our mission fulfillment. So, for example, we don't just count the number of bed nets that we distributed in Guinea and Zimbabwe. That's an interesting number, but to turn it into an impact number, we need to go a lot further. First of all, we need to gather information on the average number of people sharing each of those bed nets that was distributed. That's a data collection challenge all by itself. Then we need to figure out what number of these were children under 5, because that was key to this particular project's outcome metric. And then all of these numbers need to then be measured against peer-reviewed data that tells us clearly the rate at which using insecticide-treated bed nets like these save the lives of preschool-aged children. And that's what's required to get that number of the lives of children under 5 that were saved by this project. When we're measuring child marriage in Bangladesh, for example, you can see that there we're using a different age cutoff of 18, because that's a much more relevant definition of child for this particular project. Now over to the Toronto Wildlife Centre, if you're asking yourself, which wildlife are we building a healthy community for exactly, you can see that the answer is mostly birds. If you were worried it was wasps, not wasps, birds. Also some mammals, some reptiles, and 4 very lucky amphibians. In terms of species at risk admissions, 103. And all of this data is captured by the species identification as each of these animals are admitted to the inpatient wildlife hospital. No matter where you run a data team, whether it's nonprofit, for-profit, public sector, ROI is always going to be critical to the business case for technical investments. But there's a special wrinkle in the case of nonprofits, where there's so many eyes on overhead spending. And in the nonprofit world, there's a very precise definition of overhead, which means it is administrative costs and fundraising costs, which we track both separately and together. And these are published widely. It's not just inside our own annual report. There are third parties like Charity Intelligence, where I took this excerpt from, as well as MoneySense. And I've shared an example of these kinds of things on the screen. But what's important to keep in mind is, at least in Canada, currently there aren't hard caps that say, this is what your administrative limit is, this is what your overhead, your fundraising limit has to be. But having said that, we know that institutional funders and donors alike care a lot about this number. So that means we need to take it very, very seriously. So aside from that being another type of work that the data team has to do, there's a bigger impact, right? Because what is an IT team? We're an operating cost. So everything we do drives up this number at the same time as we're trying to establish that it's going down. So any technical investment that doesn't have a clear positive return on investment in the first year is much harder to justify, because it's going to have an adverse effect on these numbers that matter so much to us. And as we all know, those really big, meaningful data projects to clean up infrastructure, reduce tech debt, data quality, data management, metadata, they have a very long runway for ROI. So there's an irony here that I want to call out as well, because naturally, all of our funders require data and analytics specific to the projects that they're funding. And as we've just covered, the public also wants data and analytics, proving that we're keeping our objectives effectively and we're keeping the operating costs while we do that. But as everyone in this room knows, if you want to do data work well, even just the dashboards and reporting, you have a very big variety of costs associated with that. It's not just building the reports and the dashboards and the data marts and the APIs and all of that good stuff. Every time you build one of these things, you're raising your ongoing IT operating costs, because you need people to maintain them, keep them up to date, refresh them in light with operational changes. So there's a real observer effect here. The more reports we generate for more audiences, proving we're keeping our operating costs low, are driving up our operating costs. And this is a conversation that I'm hearing at more and more nonprofit roundtables lately. And I do think that part of the solution here is just making sure we're creating awareness, especially with the larger, more institutional funders, of the impact that they themselves are having on nonprofit operating costs every time they change the type or format or transmission method of the data that they require of us. And so again, because we keep our operating costs low to focus as much of revenue as possible on our mission, IT teams at nonprofits are always going to be very lean, which means we need to pick our highest priority work very carefully. We have very rigorous prioritization methods to make sure that even if a project is a great idea, if it's not going to have the highest ROI, it gets pushed down the pipeline. Among other things, one of the ways we manage this at Plan to keep our operating IT-related costs low is by tracking which dashboards and reports are actually opened on which stage of the cycle, to make sure that we're refreshing them and offering them at an appropriate interval, not offering, for example, a real-time daily report that turns out only to be needed quarterly. It also helps us make sure that we're not wasting any time on maintenance cost associated with a report that it turns out nobody's really using anymore. And in some cases, it helps offer an early warning sign of a report that isn't really keeping up with operating conditions, in which case we can prioritize some quick fixes to make that report more relevant and watch the usage metrics start to go up again. And so I know this is a common problem in a lot of organizations, but if you find that you're maintaining hundreds of dashboards and you're not really sure which, if any of them, are still being used, this is really well worth tracking, at least sometimes, right? Even doing a small observational project, because it's a great way to find out ways to cut IT ongoing effort. So I recommend this approach no matter what sector you're in or how generous your budget would be. I would say there is a real upside, though. Everybody knows how hard tech hiring would be. And I would say one of the biggest upsides, if not the biggest upside that I have ever seen about working in IT in a nonprofit is the sheer caliber of the teams that we attract. The quality of the work is incredible. And I think there's no question that the satisfaction of doing meaningful work and fulfilling a mission that actually matters to the people allows us to attract and retain some truly phenomenal technical talent. And honestly, the IT team I'm working with right now, and especially my own data and AI teams, are the most talented folks I've ever worked with, and I am blown away by their skills and dedication every day. IT has always had social, ethical, and environmental impacts. And including those in decision-making is even more critical in a nonprofit where any of these risks can also contribute to worsening some of the exact same global social and environmental threats it's our mission to alleviate. And this is even more important now that AI is magnifying all of these risks and creating these risks in new ways. But we need to balance our need to manage the risks with the fact that we are less well-positioned and well-equipped than for-profit or probably even public sector organizations to handle the costs and the resourcing of this type of risk mitigation. So it's a bit of a tightrope. As I'm sure you're aware, all IT in particular has a very significant environmental footprint. For those of us on data teams in particularly, we're very conscious of this. Makes a very heavy use of both the energy and water. AI is worsening that as well. Pollution from data centers doesn't get nearly as much bandwidth and airtime, but it actually is really significant. There was a recent study that showed that the pollution from data centers has caused so much cancer and asthma in the United States that it's cost more than $5 billion in public health spending over the last 5 years alone. And we know that's only going to go up. And the worst part of this, I think, especially from a nonprofit perspective, thinking about this is, where are data centers located? It's not the general population who are sharing the burden of this risk, right? These are the most low-income, vulnerable people in the population who are being exposed to these rates of cancer and asthma as a direct result of IT work. So other IT risks would include equity and access. I've seen a few of you already mention these in your presentations so far at this conference. So basically, we need to ensure that the use of technology to access services does not create any new inequities or barriers to accessing vital services. And when it comes to AI specifically, we also want to ensure our policies support fairness and non-discrimination, ensure unbiased outcomes, and allow us to maintain trust with the communities that we serve. So in response to this, at Plan, we have greatly expanded our IT governance model as a direct response to the new and increased risks posed by artificial intelligence. So the core of this model is a position statement that was established that is based on our values, our organizational values and mission, and then we used this to build out an assessment matrix that combines both technical and value-based perspectives. So it ensures that every major AI initiative that we even consider launching is first thoroughly evaluated for technical, but also ethical, social, and environmental risks, along with mitigation strategies and human oversight. There are also some unique elements to data governance in the charitable sector more broadly that I'd like to briefly touch on. For one thing, nonprofit operations are not subject to PIPEDA as they're not commercial activity. So obviously this is beneficial in some ways. Nobody likes more regulation. But on the other hand, regulation does provide a certain, framework within which to work. So in the absence of this, nonprofits are a little bit on our own in navigating that tension between we want to offer the maximum possible privacy protections, but we also need to keep our operating costs low. And this is something that I'm seeing coming up with more and more charities. It's being raised as a topic. And I've seen it particularly at a few roundtables and technical committees recently, including at the Digital Governance Standards Institute. I think all nonprofits would really love to offer the kind of high-quality service to donors like we can say, for example, the right to be forgotten. We would love to commit to very quickly purging all of someone's data from our systems upon request, which in some jurisdictions is mandatory. But practically speaking, as I think any of you who are on the technical side of data knows, this is actually a really big job because this type of data touches multiple systems. And so this type of careful pruning to eliminate the data that we've agreed to reduce is actually, it requires a very careful hand because at the same time, we cannot risk accidentally deleting things that we must for audit purposes keep, which would include, for example, financial transaction data related to that donor. So in general, and I think all nonprofits will have a different place on this line, we have to walk a very fine line between what we want to commit to over and above what's mandatory for us, and then what we actually have the staffing size to deliver on. Another compliance piece worth mentioning, the work we do is really interesting, and it's often unique enough that it potentially holds very significant research value. So all of this effort that we put into to ensure that we have clear and verifiable data streams for all of our outcome and project data means that it can be used in studies that not only allow us to continuously improve our own programs, but in some cases can even be shared with social science researchers. But if we think this is a possibility, we need to know that going right out of the gate so that we can build those formal consent processes for the additional research into the very beginning of the process to make sure that the participants know, understand, and consent to the sharing of that data. And that's going to be very relevant to the next part of my presentation in a moment. Not-for-profit funding and success, like all organizations' operating functions, is linked to good quality data. And some traditional donor-funded models have evolved in recent years to more complex results-based payment methods, which would include, for example, social impact bonds. In practical language, what this means is that in order to recoup our programmatic costs, even when we already have a commitment with a funder or a major institution, we need to prove that we've had the intended effect and outcomes, and we need to quantify that result. These approaches rely on rigorous and very costly data systems to prove those outcomes. They require continuous and long-term intensive tracking of individual participants to establish whether both the immediate and the long-term results have been achieved. In other words, longitudinal data. So to share what that looks like with you in the real world, we're going to walk you through a case study of one of our program participants, Miriam. Meet Miriam. Miriam is 10 years old. Like many of the other children in her community, she spends her days at home doing chores or helping to take care of her siblings. During the planting and the harvest season, everyone in Miriam's family has to help out because the food they grow is the food the family has to eat. So Plan International begins a donor-funded intervention in Miriam's local community to give basic education to all of the children who are out of school. And Miriam is so excited when her parents say the Plan staff has convinced them that Miriam should join and can start going to school. She gets to learn. So the very first data capture point we have here, to register for the program, everyone must attend an in-person registration event in the community. And to be eligible to participate, children must be between the ages of 8 and 16, so guardians are asked to bring the proof of date of birth. But Miriam doesn't have a birth certificate. She doesn't have any formal documents showing her date of birth. In fact, her parents don't know the exact date of birth. They know she was born during the rainy season in 2015, and that's as much as they can tell us. Next, the project needs to collect some other basic information about Miriam, including her parents' names, contact numbers, and the community she lives in. All of this is happening in an area with no internet access. So the Plan staff complete registrations using software in their tablets on offline mode, which they then have to sync to the internet when they return to the office. But before collecting any information, they review the consent statement with the guardians present. Most of the guardians have low literacy or no literacy, which is why this has to be done in person and verbally. The staff also have to review the consent document verbally in the local language, which means in this particular district alone, there are 4 languages, so before we can even capture the names and the birth dates, this process needs 4 different translators. Among other things, the consent explains that the data will be collected in digital software and which countries will be involved, which may be because of the location of the project stakeholders, in other cases of where the data will be stored or transferred and their rights to the data. In this case, for example, Canada be one of those stakeholder countries because we would need to share the project outcome data with Canadian donors. In this project, if Miriam's parents do not consent to the mandatory data needed, she'll not be eligible to participate. She cannot go to school. And if Miriam's parent does not attend the registration event, Miriam will not be eligible unless the project team and the translator follows up with her at home on another date for consent and registration. If at any point Miriam's parents withdraw consent, then the project cannot count Miriam even if she fully participates, which means they can't be reimbursed based on her outcomes if this is an outcome-based programming project. I hope that walking you through all the steps required to gather information on Miriam has helped illustrate the simple but very real barriers that create challenge for data management, governance, and even capture in low-tech environments. So this particular example is, in many cases, specific to developing countries, but I think you'll be able to see how a lot of the same types of issues are also relevant for nonprofits who are working for other groups right here in Canada, including refugees, migrants, newcomers, and the unhoused. And these barriers include gaps in the availability of formal verifiable sources, informed consent of parents for programming dedicated to children, and later, the ability to share these full data sets with donors and auditors. Finally, for international organizations such as PLAN, data and privacy standards from multiple countries might apply, which means multi-factor authentication in many cases is mandatory, but it's very limited in low connectivity settings. So now I know you're all wondering, did Miriam get to join the program and go to school? Yes, she did. Miriam's mother stayed back from the farm for the important registration event, and the project team worked with her to decide on a reasonable date of birth, which was used for registration. So in the absence of a formal document, PLAN organized a situation where her mother and a local community leader filled out an attestation form saying this was the date of birth that would be used for her going forward. And when the education program starts, Miriam shows up on her first day with a big smile on her face and ready to learn. In conclusion, I hope you found these data challenges, quantification challenges, and the strategies you use to overcome them as interesting and fulfilling as we do. No questions? Okay.
Hey, thank you so much for the presentation. I was just wondering, in terms of cost related to AI, why don't NGOs use solutions like open source? Although I know it's a little bit of capex initially, but I think it can be done during downtime or things like that, and it's overall, I think it will increase the efficiency. And at the same time, since you will have some on-premises solution, it will solve data center issues like environmental and social issues at the same time. And it will make NGO more efficient at the same time. So what stops an NGO to use open source systems?
So I would say that we do use a combination of different things. I think that unless you're building on the open source systems on your own, which has its own IT costs associated with it, the ability to find out-of-the-box products that are really suitable for the AI and for the NGO or the nonprofit environment can be a little challenging. Just to take one example off the top of my head, we used a sentiment analysis script from a Python library that was designed to, assess whether the tone of particular survey feedback from donors was positive or negative. Like, we wanted to apply a sentiment analysis score, and we found that the sort of basic one that we could grab from Python actually wasn't really useful to that setting, because the donors were talking about things like, poverty and war, and so all of a sudden this gave it a negative score, even though the actual thing that the donor was saying is, I'm so glad I can donate to this, I'm so glad you're alleviating poverty in the war zone, right? So basically there was a mismatch between where the sort of free option could help us and what we actually needed. So there was a fair amount of customization. The other thing I would say is that, especially given that at PLAN we work with children's data, our data privacy rules are extremely rigorous. So we're being extremely careful to make sure any AI stuff that we do is inside our own tenant, to make sure that none of our data is going into the training model where one of our children's data could be exposed to an outside stakeholder. Thanks.